Hello friends, welcome back to my channel Mukesh English. Friends, in this video, I'm going to summarize the important lesson titled Mrs. Datta Writes a Letter, and this story is in the syllabus of second semester B.A.Generic English under Bangalore City University. And at the end of the summary, you'll find the important questions of this particular chapter, and also check the description box for all the other lessons, grammar, and the question papers links. So let's begin it. And don't forget, this is the most important lesson for examination, and you will get the maximum questions from this lesson. I hope so. So let's have the introduction about the story. Chitra Diva Karuni's Mrs. Datta writes a letter. The title was first published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1998. Later, it was included in Diva Karuni's second short story collection, The Unknown Errors of Our Lives 2001. Diva Karuni is an Indian who immigrated to the USA, United States, and Mrs. Datta Writes a Letter story is one of her many stories that explores the culture shock faced by Indian women who have made such immigrations. This story revolves around the first generation diaspora woman, Mrs. Pramila Datta, who leaves India and immigrates to the USA. Mrs. Datta looks forward to a happy life with a son and his family. However, she finds that she is ill prepared for the life. There is a wave of nostalgia sweeps her. Although she feels alone, alienated, displaced, and fervently yearns for a home. She looks for a home in India. She attempts to adapt and learn to accept life in America. The story relies on a unique plot device which helps to drive it forward. The plot device consists here two letters. One letter, Mrs. Basu's letter, and the second letter is here, Mrs. Datta's response, which plays a very important role in making Mrs. Datta realize her inner strength and change her long-held beliefs. She finally explores her inner voice of to fight the pretentious hello of happiness to a real one. So there are two letters. One is Mrs. Basu's letter, and the another one is here Mrs. Datta's response to the letter. Now, let's begin the summary. Mrs. Datta writes a letter. The story follows 2 days in the life of Mrs. Datta, an old widowed Indian woman who had come to her son's house in America just 2 months earlier. On the first morning, she gets up very early morning, prompting her son Sagar to tell her that she's waking up his wife Shamoli, and Mrs. Datta should get up also should get up later. In this way, Mrs. Datta's habits, which she learned as an arranged wife in India, conflict with the American customs of her son's family. The next morning, Mrs. Datta gets up later as ordered, but now she ends up being in the bathroom when her grandchildren need it and they complain. Mrs. Datta is surprised when Shamoli does not punish the children for being disrespectful to Mrs. Datta, the grandmother, the elder. As she does throughout the story, she compares this American behavior with the Indian customs that she has followed her whole life. She also thinks about the letter she received from her Kolkata friend, from a Calcutta friend, Mrs. Basu, who has asked if Mrs. Datta is happy in America or not. Mrs. Datta is struggling to be loyal to her son's family, although she feels uncomfortable about the life in America, so she has not sent a reply to her friend yet. She starts making aloo dum, a traditional Indian meal. In her mind, she writes a response to Mrs. Basu in her mind, right? In her mind, she is replying to the letter to Mrs. Basu saying that she misses India and then rebukes herself for being nostalgic. She continues making her meal, noting that Shamoli, her daughter-in-law, is worried that Mrs. Datta's food has too much cholesterol and is making them to gain weight. Later in the day, Mrs. Datta washes her clothes. She has insisted on doing her own laundry so that nobody else will have to touch her underclothes. However, she is terrified of the modern washing machine, so she secretly washes the clothes by hand. She hangs the clothes on the fence to dry while crafting another mental response to Mrs. Basu. She's responding to the letter of Basu, and this time she says that she's fitting in very well in America. She remembers her departure from India when she got rid of her house and gave away most of her possessions. So this is how she's replying her second response. When she's pulling the dry clothes off the fence, she notices the next door neighbor and waves to her. But the neighbor ignores her. Her son Sagar comes home early from work that day, and Mrs. Datta is happy when he enjoys the story she tells him about his childhood. However, when Shamoli arrives home, being upset, Mrs. Datta goes to her room to give them some privacy. She realizes that she left her unfinished response to Mrs. Basu on the kitchen table and she goes back to retrieve it. She overhears Shamoli, who is arguing with Sagar, saying that the next door neighbor complained about Mrs. Datta hanging her clothes over the fence. Although her sense of duty says that she should stay with her son's family, Mrs. Datta realizes that she's an outsider and that she would be much happier back in India. She writes a response to Mrs. Basu saying that she's coming back to India and asking Mrs. Basu to rent out her downstairs flat to Mrs. Datta. So that was a story, very pathetic, and I feel so sad about Mrs. Datta, and I really feel pity about such kind of generations who don't respect the elders and they feel that they belong to the new generation, everything is changed. No, everyone has to face that phase of the life. Okay, so I felt to give a character sketch of this story here, and because question may be asked, write a character sketch of so and so character. Mrs. Roma Basu, that's the full name of Mrs. Basu. Mrs. Basu is Mrs. Datta's longtime friend and neighbor in India. It is her letter that prompts Mrs. Datta to examine whether or not she's really happy or not. At the end of the story, Mrs. Datta writes to Mrs. Basu to ask if she can rent her friend's downstairs apartment, which has been recently vacated. Second character, second character, Mrinalini Datta. Mrinalini Datta is Mrs. Datta's granddaughter who is not interested in exploring her Indian heritage. Shamoli calls Mrinalini as Mini, a further sign of family's assimilation into American culture. Short name, which is transformed, washed out into English. And most important another character, Pradeep Datta. Who is Pradeep? Pradeep is Mrs. Datta's grandson, Mrinalini and Pradeep, who is not interested in exploring his Indian heritage. Shamali calls Pradeep as Pat or Pat, a further sign of the family's assimilation into American culture. The most important character, Mrs. Pramila Datta, which we call her as Mrs. Datta. Question may appear for 5 marks. Write a brief character sketch of Mrs. Pramila Datta or Mrs. Datta. Mrs. Datta is a dutiful Indian widow who experiences cultural conflict while trying to live with her son's Americanized family. Mrs. Datta wed Sagar's father in a traditional Indian marriage when she was 17-year old. Throughout her life, she has been subservient to her husband, loyal, or maybe say Agyakari and other family members, suppressing her own desire in order to fulfill the needs. When her husband dies, she lives as a widow in their home for 3 years until she is stricken with pneumonia. Her son invites her to come and live with his family, and she feels that she is following her Indian duty by accepting his invitation. Despite the misgivings of her best friend, Mrs. Basu, Mrs. Datta gives up her Calcutta home and gives away most of her possessions to the friends. When Mrs. Datta arrives at her son's home in California, she's shocked at the customs of American culture, which often clash with her traditional Indian upbringing. Throughout the story, she remembers that her life was like in India as she compares it to her immigrant experience in America. Mrs. Basu writes Mrs. Datta a letter asking Mrs. Datta if she is happy or not in America. Mrs. Datta struggles to answer this letter in a positive manner but must keep putting it aside because she is not happy. However, Mrs. Datta does not feel comfortable saying anything bad about her son and at first thinks that it would be shameful to return to India. So this was the summary of the lesson. Mrs. Dutta writes a letter. Now let's have the discussion of the important questions from the textbook. Where did Mrs. Pramila Datta immigrates to? She goes to USA, California to join her husband. To join her son who was already working there for work. Please do correct. It's a mistake here. She goes there to join her son, Sagar. What did the mother-in-law teach Pramila when she was a young bride? Pramila's mother-in-law taught her the art of making pickles when she was young bride. Why was Mrs. Pramila Datta punished by her mother-in-law, and what is the punishment? Mrs. Pramila Datta was punished by her mother-in-law for making pickles that were very salty. The punishment was that she had to eat the salty pickles she had made. Then name any two occasions mentioned in the letter by Mrs. Basu, Diwali and Durga Puja. What were the three things that Mrs. Datta missed the most in California? She missed her family, the monsoon rains, and the sweet smell of earth after the rain. What was the most important question asked by Mrs. Basu in the letter, and why was Mrs. Datta putting off the reply? The important question by Mrs. Basu in the letter was about Mrs. Datta, Pramila's decision to return to India, and Mrs. Datta was putting off the reply because she was unsure about her future plans. Then, why did Shamoli stop her mother-in-law from meeting the American neighbors? Shamali stopped her mother-in-law from meeting the American neighbors because she was worried about cultural misunderstandings and language barriers. Where did Mrs. Datta finally manage to dry her clothes? Mrs. Datta finally managed to dry her clothes on the rooftop of their apartment building. So this is how we have discussed the important lesson. Mrs. Datta writes a letter. I have done a mistake here in the first question. Mrs. Datta goes to California, America to stay with her son Sagar, not with her husband. Kindly correct, it's a typo error. So thank you so much for watching this video. Click on the like button, share the video, subscribe the channel. Any questions, any queries, mail me at mukeshenglish@gmail.com. Stay tuned with Mukesh English.